blood and power. These were the twin obsessions that had driven Henry VIII's reign, and they were the very poisons consuming him in his final days. In the frozen winter of 1547, the once mighty King of England lay entombed in his own flesh, a grotesque parody of the Golden Prince who had once dazzled Europe. "The lion is dying," whispered the courtiers beyond the doors of Whitehall Palace. Yet, even then, they reminded each other his claws were still sharp and his wrath could still destroy. The transformation was almost incomprehensible. In his youth, Henry had been celebrated as the very image of Renaissance vitality, tall, athletic, his broad chest armored in gold, jousting with knights, composing music, charming ambassadors with his wit. He had been the mirror of princes, the embodiment of vigor. But time, indulgence, and endless injuries had turned him into a monstrous tyrant, gasping for breath in chambers heavy with incense. The journey from golden boy to decaying giant was not sudden. It was the result of decades of slow, relentless torture by his own body. By January 1547, Henry's body was a battlefield. He weighed nearly 400 pounds, his bulk so massive that servants had to use mechanical hoists to move him. His legs were riddled with ulcers, so deep and festering that bone could sometimes be glimpsed through the rotting tissue. The stench was unbearable, an odor of death and corruption that clung to his chamber like a curse. Courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, while others vomited after leaving his presence. Incense burned constantly, but the sweet smoke only mingled with the stench, creating a nauseating haze. The king himself was trapped in his own flesh, each movement sending waves of agony through his ruined limbs. His physicians exhausted every tool in the medieval arsenal. They drained his blood, hoping to balance his humors. They plastered his sores with poultices made of boiled onions, honey, herbs, even powdered human skulls, convinced that the essence of bone might heal bone. They tried charms, whispered prayers, even the application of freshly cut pigeons to his ulcers, a grotesque ritual meant to draw out infection. Nothing worked. If anything, the treatments worsened his torment. Only opium dulled the pain, yet it clouded his mind further, plunging him into a haze of confusion and delirium. Historians now believe Henry suffered from diabetes, gout, and chronic bone infections. But for those who stood in his chamber, there was no diagnosis, only the slow torture of watching their king rot alive. His suffering was not quiet. Palace workers whispered that his screams echoed through the stone corridors of Whitehall, a chilling sound in the dead of night. The torment was not only physical. His mind unraveled alongside his body. The famous temper that once cowed nobles now erupted in terrifying outbursts of blind rage, followed by periods of lethargy and despair. He would rant about conspiracies, imagine phantom betrayals, and accuse attendants of treason. Sometimes he spoke to the dead, calling out for Anne Boleyn, executed by his own order, or for Thomas More, whose head had once adorned a spike above London Bridge. He saw their faces in dreams and, worse, in waking nightmares. It was as if the ghosts of those he had destroyed had returned to torment him in his final days. Religion, which Henry had bent to his will in life, now offered no peace. One day he demanded Catholic rituals, clinging to the faith of his ancestors. The next, he ordered Protestant prayers, as if desperate to hedge his soul against eternal damnation. His chaplain recorded that Henry awoke in terror, crying out that he saw the spirits of the condemned gathered at the foot of his bed in silent judgment. This was no longer the king who had defied the Pope and torn England from Rome. This was a dying man, uncertain, racked with doubt, staring into an eternity he could not control. But while Henry wrestled with his own mortality, the living vultures circled. The court seethed with intrigue, for his death would open the gates to power. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had given him a frail 9-year-old son, Edward, but the boy was no ruler. Who would hold the throne through him? Two factions schemed in silence. the Catholics, led by the aging Duke of Norfolk, and the Protestants, led by Edward Seymour, the boy's ambitious uncle. Even as Henry lay dying, he signed execution orders with trembling hands, paranoid that enemies might rise before he was cold in the grave. The deception of strength continued beyond his chamber walls. Proclamations declared the king healthy and vigorous, but reality told another story. Behind the guarded doors of Whitehall, attendants performed the grim daily ritual of managing his failing body, cleaning sores that gushed foul fluid, shifting his enormous bulk on sheets already soaked with sweat and pus, and praying he would survive the night. The royal bed itself had become an altar of suffering, draped in dark fabrics, its canopy heavy with the odor of rot and incense. To see the king was to glimpse a man already half in the grave. On January 27th, 1547, his body finally betrayed him beyond recovery. Witnesses saw Henry convulse in a seizure so violent that servants pinned him to his bed to prevent injury. When it passed, his right side was paralyzed, his speech slurred, his face twisted. Today we know it was a massive stroke. His physicians, desperate and terrified, resorted to torture disguised as treatment. They pressed hot irons against his skin, forced bitter concoctions down his throat, and prayed for a miracle. Nothing worked. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, his most trusted spiritual advisor, took control of the chamber. Access was restricted, silence enforced, secrets locked behind closed doors. Even Catherine Parr, his sixth and surviving wife, was barred during his worst episodes. For those who glimpsed him, the scene was unforgettable. The once mighty King of England, drooling, screaming, trembling, his body rotting, while his mind flickered between rage and despair. Henry VIII had lived as a tyrant who tortured others with his power. Now, at the end, it was his own flesh that tortured him, day after day, night after night. He was no longer the Lion of England. He was the carcass of one, bleeding, bloated, and afraid. As January bled into February, Henry's body began to collapse in earnest. His breaths came ragged, his voice broke into whispers, and attendants could no longer deny what they had concealed for months. The lion was finally dying. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer leaned close to his sovereign, asking if he placed his faith in Christ. Henry's tongue failed him, his mouth slack, his face distorted by the stroke, but he managed to squeeze Cranmer's hand. That squeeze, fragile yet deliberate, would echo through history, Protestants claiming it as a final embrace of reform, Catholics dismissing it as the reflex of a man already lost to delirium. Before dawn on the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII died. The official record described his passing with the simple phrase, "natural decay." But decay had not been natural. It had been violent, grotesque, almost theatrical. His body was a wreck of ulcers, infections, obesity, and disease. The king who had once thundered across Europe now lay still, bloated and ruined, his chamber suffused with the sweet-sick stench of a corpse too far gone. And yet, his death was not immediately announced. The Privy Council kept the secret for 3 full days. The corpse cooled, while Edward Seymour and his allies moved with ruthless precision. Castles were seized, rivals silenced, and the boy king Edward VI proclaimed. By the time the bells of London tolled on January 31, the realm was already in Seymour's grasp. Even in death, Henry remained a weapon his silence manipulated to secure the future. But the greatest horror lay not in his life, nor even in his death, but in what came after. His body began to decompose at a speed that shocked even seasoned embalmers. They sliced him open, scooping out organs rotted with infection, stuffing the cavity with herbs and resins. Even then, the stench persisted. His coffin, built nearly twice the size of a normal noble's, strained under his swollen corpse. During the lying in state at Whitehall, gases burst through the lead lining. Dark fluids seeped onto the chapel floor. Witnesses claimed dogs lapped at the leaking rot. It was a final humiliation for a man who had once fashioned himself as God's chosen monarch. Still, the Tudors cloaked the horror with theatre. On February 16, black-draped horses hauled the colossal coffin through London's streets. Effigies showed Henry not as the decaying mass inside, but as the Holbein king, broad-shouldered, legs apart, fists on hips, staring down the world. The crowd wept, not for the bloated tyrant, but for the myth he had built. In St. George's Chapel at Windsor, he was laid beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son, the only one who had escaped his wrath by dying too soon. But even as his body crumbled, Henry's grasp endured. His will laid out succession with meticulous control. First Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Though briefly disrupted by Lady Jane Grey, his plan would ultimately hold, shaping England for half a century. In this way, the man who tortured himself and others clutched power beyond the grave. Yet even his carefully crafted regency plan shattered quickly. Edward Seymour outmaneuvered the council and declared himself Lord Protector. Henry's iron words, written with such precision, were no match for the chaos left in his wake. Across Europe, news of his death spread with unease. Francis I, once his bitter rival, offered sincere mourning. Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, calculated the vulnerabilities of a kingdom under a child. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry, ordered a mass for his soul. Even Rome, which had branded him heretic, recognized that his death altered the balance of Christendom. In England, his absence was felt like a wound. For nearly 40 years, Henry's voice had been law, his whims shaping the lives of millions. Now he was gone, and fear filled the void. Parish records describe strange omens, blazing comets, prophetic dreams, ghostly visions. Servants at Whitehall swore that his chamber grew cold at night, that muffled groans seeped from the walls, that shadows shifted in corners where no one stood. The young Edward VI refused to sleep in his father's bed, insisting it was cursed. Physicians across centuries would puzzle over Henry's final illness. Syphilis, scurvy, diabetes, CTE from years of jousting diagnoses multiplied with each generation. But his treatments were torture in themselves. Pigeons split in half and pressed against wounds, potions of gold and crushed gems, herbs ground into pastes that festered on his flesh. Medicine in Tudor England was less science than ritual cruelty, and in Henry's final days, it only magnified his agony. Among the royal treasures left behind, servants found a locked chest. Inside were not jewels or seals of office, but human relics, a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of his mother's hair, a child's prayer book, likely Elizabeth's. For all the horror, these fragments revealed a man who, even while his body decayed, clung to the intimacy of family. They were tokens of tenderness, hidden inside the chamber of a tyrant. But tenderness could not mask legacy. Henry's corpse itself became metaphor. Preachers compared his rotting flesh to the corruption of the realm, his ulcered legs to the diseased state of England's soul. Just as his body had required radical surgery, reformers argued, so too did the nation. Henry had torn England from Rome, but in death he left behind only contradictions, half Catholic, half Protestant, and wholly unstable. His children would inherit not peace but a storm. Radical Protestantism under Edward, bloody Catholic restoration under Mary, and Elizabeth's cautious middle way. Henry VIII died as he lived, wrapped in contradictions. His funeral was glorious, yet his coffin leaked rot. His will promised stability, yet his death unleashed chaos. He ruled by terror, yet in death he was powerless, stripped of crown, titles, and the command that once made nobles tremble. Perhaps the truest image of Henry is not Holbein's portrait, but the sight of a bloated corpse splitting its own coffin, fluids seeping onto a chapel floor, while dogs licked at the remains. The king who had tortured others with fear and power ended his life tortured by his own flesh. The man who had sought to dominate eternity was reduced to what all men become, carrion awaiting judgment. And in that judgment, as Archbishop Cranmer reminded him, no crown, no throne, No earthly power could protect him, for the Lion of England had roared his last, and even lions must rot